Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome, everyone, to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's been too long since we've been live together, and I am thrilled to be back with you again on this Monday. We are into November. Today is the second day of November in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be back live with you as well. I hope you are all well. I hope that our program today warrants your faith in us that keeps you coming and keeps you tuned in, and do invite you to participate actively in the program. If you'd be inclined to give us a buzz, our phone number is area code 304-640-6495. That's 304-640-6495. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, is WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. That's WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. And again, I do remind you that we have a Facebook page dedicated to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll gain access to our Facebook page. And I will say that over the last 4 or 5 days, I've put 3 or 4 different things on there. Some of them substantive, and a few of them probably not as substantive as they should be. But I think that's one of the draws of Facebook. We tend to emote online, as it were. And but anyway, I did put a couple of pieces on there. In fact, an hour or 2 hours before the program today, I put on a short summary of what I thought we were going to be doing today, looking at Alexander Hamilton's financial program. If you recall, that's where we were when last we were together. We were denied access to a live program last week due to technical difficulties, and hopefully they've been worked out, and we will be able to conduct our full agenda of programs this week. I remind you that tomorrow is Tuesday. We'll be beginning our program 1/2 hour later than today. It'll be 1:30 p.m. in the East, and that's Eastern Standard Time. We're no longer on Eastern Daylight Time. So it'll be 1:30 tomorrow afternoon for our Tuesday program. And then on Wednesday, we'll return to our regular starting time, which in the East will be 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Again, I invite you to participate actively in our program. I want to thank you for your continued support, not only of the Virtual Center, but of the Head On Radio Network. If, like me, you've been looking at the post that Bob Kincaid has put on Facebook over the last couple of days about funding programming at the Horn, you are aware, as I am, that obviously finance continues to be an issue. But the fact of the matter is that the program has remained on the air for better than 10 years. We're into its 11th year. Here at the Virtual Center, we're approaching our 3rd year of live broadcasting, and I'm quite thrilled about that. And so it's obvious that we do not need a lot of money to maintain programming, but the network sure does and can use whatever support you might be able to give it. I can't tell you the number of people that I've run into that said, if I'm ever fortunate to hit Powerball or some other lottery function and experience a windfall, the Horn is one of the first places that I will go with that money. I feel the same way. I know many of you do as well. But be aware also that small donations and small pieces of support, $5, $10 here and there, major help. So again, I do thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Hit On Radio Network, and I want you to know, I'm sure you do, that we appreciate it very, very much. As I mentioned, I anticipate on today's program returning to Hamilton's program. We kind of left Hamilton's program in midair, so to speak. The last time we were together, we had looked at the first two portions of his program, namely the funding of the national debt and the assumption of state debts. And we were talking about funding as a concept, as an economic concept, and we were talking about the questions that arise over Hamilton's financial program. The major one being, and I think this is the one that, as a historian, that attracts me, it attracted me from the very beginning, is whether, in fact, the principal intent of Hamilton's program was financial at all, a question mark. There's clear evidence, some of it from Hamilton himself, that the principal thrust of that program was in large part political. Now again, whether you say it's more political than economic, or whether you say it's both political and economic, or whether you say that it's more one than the other, the fact of the matter is, it is both to a degree. And so the question is, I think, whether in fact there is a priority. I personally believe that Hamilton's principal goal, principal motive in this financial program was political. There's a lot of evidence, comments that he made in letters to indicate that politics was never far from the forefront of his agenda as he put the financial program together. In response to concerns from Oliver Wolcott, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the early 90s and replaced Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury when Hamilton left office in 1795. And I believe I mentioned, so let me mention it again, that Hamilton was the brunt of charges of fraud that came from a vote in the House of Representatives. And ultimately, it's that more than anything else, and the embarrassment that it brought to the Washington administration, that caused him to resign the office as Secretary of the Treasury. There's absolutely no question then that, for example, when Wolcott complained about the financial or the economic situations created by Hamilton's financial program, and this was 4 or 5 years after the program was underway, this was in 1795, Oliver Wolcott wrote, I believe I read this before, but I think it's a telling commentary on the economic substance of Hamilton's program. Wolcott says in a letter to Hamilton, "Our foreign resources are dried up. Our domestic are deeply anticipated, at least as respects the bank." We'll get to the bank in a moment. "Banks are multiplying like mushrooms. The prices of all our exports are impaired by paper negotiations and unfounded projects, so that no foreign market will indemnify the shippers. Our commerce is harassed by war, and our internal revenue unproductive of the expected sums, owing to prejudice, combination, and want of competent officers. Usury absorbs much of the capital, which might be calculated upon as a resource if visionary speculations could be destroyed." And again, I mentioned Wolcott's use of the term visionary speculations and usury, because what we are talking about here, of course, in usury is the astronomical cost of borrowing money. And of course, what we're talking about with visionary speculations are the financial opportunities made available in Hamilton's program. In other words, what Walcott is pointing out is that there are clearly serious economic problems with Hamilton's program. Hamilton's response is that the worst evil that the nation can experience is inefficiency in the measures of government. Hamilton says, quote, "The consideration of expense is of no moment compared with the advantages of energy," unquote. So, of course, the issue here is the power and the effectiveness of government. Clearly, a major consideration of Hamilton's in the introduction of this particular program is to make government more effective, more dynamic, more visible in the eyes of the American people. It clearly is, and we know this from Hamilton's speeches, from things he said in the Federalist Papers, that dynamism and energy in government to Hamilton is critical. Hamilton was, for example, I think we read this some time ago here at the Virtual Center, during the War for Independence itself, Hamilton cautioned in an essay under a pseudonym called The Continentalist in the newspapers, in the New York newspapers, that we needed to be careful about the attacks that we were making on government as part of the efforts to criticize Parliament and to criticize the role of the king in its treatment of the colonies. Hamilton's warning was that in attacking government, we need to be very careful, because in the mind of the general public, we are sending a very dangerous message when we do that. We are suggesting that it's okay to attack government. It's okay to not obey government. It's okay to question legitimate authority. And Hamilton points out in this essay that that is a point of view which will come back to bite us if we're not careful. Hamilton's concern was the last thing you can afford to do is to give the general population, the masses, the idea that government's authority does not require obedience. Hamilton believes that if government's laws are not obeyed and government's will is not adhered to, any society is in line for serious problems. The point I'm making is that you can go all the way back in Hamilton and you can find evidences to support his concern that the power and vitality and vigor of government is critical to social peace and harmony in any society. It stands to reason then that in his financial program, political considerations would be near the top of his agenda, the top of his priority list, so to speak. And he mentions that in his response to Walcott, when he urges Walcott to not worry about the economic concerns and recognize that the biggest issue is energy in government. The implication then clearly is that energy in government is what this program is really all about. And so it seems to me the next question, and this is the one we were dealing with the last time we were together here at the Virtual Center, it seems to me the next issue we need to consider is the source of that energy itself. What is Hamilton talking about when he's talking about energy in government? It seems that what he's talking about is the loyalty of the most powerful individuals in society and their support for government. Hamilton clearly believes that the support of the wealthy and the powerful and the influential will determine whether this government under the Constitution has a chance to be successful or not. And so there's no question that in his mind, his program, his financial program, is aimed specifically at benefiting those particular interests. He is doing everything he can do in this program to win the support, the ongoing support, of society's most influential and powerful people. And the two parts of his program that we covered already were the funding of the national debt and the assumption of state debts. And we know that the total of these two programs, funding and assumption, together totaled in excess of $90 million, which in 1789-1790 was a pretty healthy piece of change. And so by proposing in these two parts of his program that the new government take on a $90 million debt at the very outset of its existence, raises serious economic questions, no doubt. So therefore, one must conclude that if there are economic risks in a new government taking on that kind of debt so early in its existence, then Hamilton must believe that the political benefits will offset that risk, or at least make that risk worthwhile. And so the question is, how does the funding and assumption together constitute winning the support of the most powerful and the most influential in society? And the answer, no question, is in the speculation opportunities that these two pieces of legislation present. There's opportunity for moneyed people to make real money in these programs by giving these people the kind of inside information that makes it possible for them to speculate in the debt, to buy up depreciated securities, knowing that these securities will be redeemed by the new government at their face value, and that they will carry interest. And there's no question that the $90 million principal of the debt is of little concern to Hamilton, because he doesn't really want the debt paid off right away anyway. What he wants is the interest to be paid. And what that would mean is those who hold the bulk of the debt, the speculators, will be receiving substantial payments on that debt from government every year toward the principal of this particular obligation. We talked about the fact that from James Madison's perspective in the House of Representatives, funding itself is not opposed Madison has no problem with funding. What he does have a problem with is the unfairness of speculation. The opportunities available to a few to get rich off this program, while the people that really earn the debt, earn the certificates, don't get the benefits of the program. So Madison wants the program to discriminate between the original holders, the original recipients of the debt, the original names, people named on the debt, on the certificates, and speculators. Madison wants face value to be paid to the original holders of the debt and a reduced percentage of that face value paid to speculators. And Hamilton and those that support him do everything they can do to successfully defeat the idea of discrimination between original holders and speculators. The irony is, and I hope that I've been able to make clear what I think this is all about. The reality is that rewarding speculators is exactly what Hamilton wants to do. So if Madison's proposal passed, and if Hamilton was forced to discriminate between original holders of the debt and speculators, he would be defeating his own political purposes for the program. So Hamilton is able to successfully defeat it. The assumption portion of this program, however, presents a different problem. And as we mentioned last time, the principal issue surrounding assumption is that all states don't owe on the debt equally. That some states, mostly southern states, have made it a point under the Articles to pay off significant portions of their Revolutionary War debt. Whereas many states in the North, in the Northeast, New England, New York, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, etc., those large financial centers of the new nation, where the nation's commercial potential is housed, where its merchants do business, where its banks are located, etc. These states don't do a whole lot toward paying off their debts. Consequently, when Hamilton proposes assumption of state debts, and as I recall, the number, that assumption, the size of the debt, the portion of the debt that assumption would comprise was in the neighborhood of 25 million of the 90 million. So it was a little bit less than 25%, a little bit less than a third, a little bit more than a quarter of the debt. The first time that the assumption bill comes before Congress, it is defeated. And what we see in the votes, especially the votes on assumption and later on the creation of the United States Bank, is that most of the opposition to these elements of Hamilton's program come from the South and from the West, whereas most of the support for it comes from the cities in the North and in the Northeast. And that makes perfect sense, it seems to me. Obviously, the southern states have trouble with a recommendation that their citizens should help pay off the debts of states that did little or nothing to pay off their own debts, especially since citizens in southern states had helped their states pay off their debt. So naturally, there seems to be an element of unfairness here. And when the assumption bill comes up for a vote, it is defeated. I think one of the things to keep in mind, I know we mentioned this before, because I believe it's important. From the get-go, from the very beginning of Hamilton's program, he envisions the entire program as just that, a program, a package, an interdependent whole. And he believes, and it says so in a number of places that I've seen, that to defeat portions of the program is to sabotage the entire program. In other words, the only way it can work is if it all has a chance to work, is Hamilton's position throughout. So now Hamilton faces a problem. And that is the very practical problem of how to get a positive vote on assumption through Congress. And the stories are that Thomas Jefferson, opponent though he is, saves the day for assumption. In conversation with his cabinet colleague, Jefferson invites Hamilton and a number of his Virginia and Maryland friends to a dinner party. At that dinner party, Hamilton issues a quid pro quo deal for the Southern delegates. If Southern congressmen will switch their votes and support the assumption bill, he will use his influence in northern states with northern congressmen to make certain that the location of the national capital will be secured on the Potomac River. There is absolutely no question that that quid pro quo deal is what gets assumption through the Congress of the United States. And I don't think, as I recall, that we did anything further with the national capital. Let me share with you a little bit of the story, what I know about the location of the national capital. There is every reason to believe, even during the War for Independence itself, during the Revolution, there's every reason to believe that if independence is successful, then wherever the national capital is located stands to reason to be the financial and political power center of the nation. In other words, there are 13 individual states that under the Articles will form a confederation. And government at the confederation level, at the national level, so to speak, will be conducted principally by Congress. Under the Articles, there's no president, there's no Senate, there's no court per se. There is a Congress. So it stands to reason that the members of Congress from the different states will have to meet somewhere. And so the assumption is, from the very beginning, during the war itself, that that state or that region that can land the national capital is in a priority position to become the financial commercial center of the new nation. And so it stands to reason that different places, different regions, different cities would lobby actively for that privilege of being picked as the national capital. I've done a lot of reading on the location of the national capital. I've read articles and letters. Let me tell you that this is one of the most complicated, difficult to understand issues that I've come across in a long time. What makes it difficult is the degree of detail. Let me explain what I mean. There are so many variables, so many issues involved, so many different considerations associated with the location of the national capital that states and cities and regions begin to compete for it. And they begin to form alliances with other people, other regions, and other states to possibly win the final vote for the location of the national capital. And what makes it difficult is that these alliances continually change. They break down and reconstitute themselves with different states for different reasons, and many of the reasons are clearly political. In other words, depending on particular political issues at the time, states and cities and regions will enter into or opt out of agreements that they have made with others for their own advantage. And it becomes extremely difficult to get your arms around these shifting alliances. There are so many variables involved. And let me just give you an idea of some of the most obvious ones. No question, the first consideration, or a first consideration, for location of the national capital is its standing relative to the rest of the nation. Most people conclude, most people realize that it only makes sense that the capital be located near the middle, near the center of the Union. That it not be in Boston, for example, or that it not be in Savannah, Georgia, for example. Because those two places are too far north or too far south to have a reasonable chance of winning support, enough support to attract a majority vote. It stands to reason that those areas toward the center of the nation, or the coast, if you will, looking at the 13 colonies going all the way from New England down to Georgia, it stands to reason that the successful location of the national capital is probably going to be somewhere toward the middle. It doesn't have to be in the middle, but it has to be somewhat near it. For example, Boston is out of the running from the very beginning. It's too far north. But New York isn't. And many people believe that the city of New York, because of its location and because of its commercial potential, should seriously be considered as the national capital. Well, there's no question that Philadelphia thinks the same way. And it's further south than New York, so actually it's closer to the center of the Union than is New York. So on the surface, at least, Philadelphia would seem to have a leg up on the others. But then there's Baltimore. Baltimore is a budding, thriving metropolis during the 1780s. It's growing fast, and its wealth and the degree of its commerce is growing rapidly. And while there's some question as to whether Maryland is a southern state in the southern bloc or whether it's a northern state in the northern bloc, that debate is usually determined by the power of Baltimore within the state. In other words, at those times when Baltimore packs the clout, so to speak, it seems able to pull the state into the northern sphere of states. But when Baltimore falls out of favor for any reason, then the planter aristocracy, the large tobacco plantation owners in the southern portions of Maryland along the Potomac, where most of the power in the state, in the colony originally was when it was first established, tend to be in the driver's seat. And because the planters of Maryland have so much in common with the planters of Virginia across the Potomac River, there seems to be a natural alliance between Maryland and Virginia that would seem to dictate that a capital on the Potomac would be perfect for both of them. And so during the war, even before the war ends, visionary financial gurus, investors, begin to see the potential, the distinct possibility of a likely decision in favor of the Potomac. 3 years before the war officially ends in 1780, interests from Virginia and Maryland meet and establish what is called the Potomac Company, which is a commercial company made up of investors from both Maryland and Virginia. George Washington, is president of the Potomac Company. Governor Thomas Johnson of Maryland is the vice president of the Potomac Company. And among the original proponents of the creation of such a company is Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is responsible for drafting a series of maps which envisions a whole internal system of canals and rivers and aqueducts throughout the internal part of the United States that would funnel all the Congress from the internal continent into the Potomac. And literally the wealth of the nation would flow down the Potomac River. And the benefits would be shared by Maryland and Virginia. And between the two, a decision is made that if their plan, their quest for a Potomac location is successful, then Virginia is willing to concede that the 10-mile square that would be the national capital will be predominantly on the Maryland side. And those of you who have ever driven into Washington, D.C. from Virginia know that as you cross those bridges across the Potomac, you're driving into Maryland. But of course, as we know now, you're driving into the district, the 10 square mile district of Columbia. But to look at the maps and to look at the intricacies of the planning and all these rivers that we hear about. I know here in West Virginia, for example, people talk all the time about the Gauley because of the rafting on the Gauley. The Gauley and the Susquehanna and the Ohio and all of these, that flow into the Ohio, and the Ohio flowing into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi flowing down to the Gulf, to New Orleans. All of that potential commerce, all that potential development is going to be channeled into the Potomac Basin ultimately, and out the Potomac into the Chesapeake. And the plans suggest that the national capital will indeed become the commercial and the financial center of the new nation. But that raises yet another issue, another variable. And that is that if you locate the national capital anywhere but in an existent city, if you put it in New York or in Philadelphia or in Baltimore, you've got public buildings that that government could move into. But if you put the national capital on the Potomac, then you have to build it. And so the legislation that passes Congress under the Confederation in the 80s is the stipulation that once the site is decided upon, the district will be comprised of 10 square miles. That means that if you have to build the city, literally, from nothing, that you're probably going to have a temporary location for the national capital, so that government would have the place to meet on a temporary basis while the national capital is being constructed. Once that decision is made, then that opens up competition to become the the temporary capital. Because these people are realistic to know that if you land the national capital, even for a time, and the time that's usually thrown out is 10 years, that in 10 years' time, you can establish such financial and political strength in the Union that you might be able to pull off a real coup and keep it there. Maybe you can become so powerful and so strong and so influential that you can drive legislation through Congress that'll make the temporary capital the permanent one. I've mentioned so far Boston or Savannah as being out of the question. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and the Potomac as being in play. But I mentioned before how complicated this issue is. Throughout the 1780s, there are proposals made to locate the national capital not only in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, or the Potomac, but in Camden, New Jersey, in Princeton, New Jersey, in Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland, not Baltimore, but Annapolis. So what you have going on in Maryland, clearly, is a struggle between the political leaders of Annapolis as the state capital and the merchant community located in Baltimore up at the head of the bay for power and influence in the state legislature. So when Annapolis makes a play for the national capital, it's not clear whether this is an effort to keep it away from Baltimore or whether Annapolis sees itself as a likely choice halfway between Baltimore and the Potomac. In other words, if the people supporting Annapolis believe that the worst place to put it is in Baltimore, then they would naturally conclude that the most important thing is to keep it out of Baltimore, but since Baltimore will never support the Potomac, maybe they'll both support Annapolis. My point is, that's the kind of back and forth lobbying and political stuff that's going on over the location of the national capital. It's one of the most complex, confusing stories, I think, in this entire period. There is a historian of this period, of the early national period. Most of his writing, most of his emphasis has been on the 1790s, who is currently retired. I believe he's still alive. I knew him, but I haven't seen him for several years. But I know he's retired. His name is Norman Risjord. Norman Risjord was a history professor at the University of Wisconsin when I was there as a graduate student. He, because of their priority emphases, with Merrill Jensen focusing on the Confederation and the Constitution, and Risjord focusing on the period immediately after the Constitution, it stands to reason that those two were very, very close. And that Risjord's graduate students and Jensen's graduate students became very, very close. And in my own case, when Merrill Jensen retired from the history department, Norman Risjord became the major person to approve my dissertation. Jensen was still there, but he was retired. So Risjord went from being a member of my doctoral committee to the chairman of it. And I was thrilled when it came time to defend my dissertation that Jensen came out of retirement long enough to chair my doctoral exam. And so I think I was probably the last graduate student that Merrill Jensen ever had. And I cherish that. In the early 70s, Norman Risjord published a book entitled Chesapeake Politics, 1781 to 1800. I said the early 70s. Let me give you, I have a copy of the book right here, so let me give you the exact publication date of Risjord's book. It's published in 1978. My dissertation, I received my doctorate in 1979, the year after this book was published. What Risjord did in this book called Chesapeake Politics is to look at the emergence of political parties from the time of the Constitution into the 1790s. since one of the Chesapeake colonies or states that he was focusing on, the three states he was focusing on were Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. And since my research focused principally on Maryland, then my research and Ristjord's research came very, very close to each other. In one of his chapters, Ristjord has a section, it comprises about half the chapter, on the location of the national capital. It's probably the best treatment of it that I've read, but it's still complicated because the alliances keep changing. The political winds blowing between North and South, and the lobbying and jockeying for advantage in Congress make the national capital a very complicated story. But the fact of the matter is, because there's so much political lobbying and jockeying, there's political opportunity in the issue. And Hamilton is able to take advantage of that in order to get a positive vote on assumption of state debts. By being given the opportunity at Jefferson's dinner party to make his case for assumption to the Virginia and Maryland delegates, congressmen who represent the Potomac region, Hamilton is able to offer the deal of the national capital in return for a positive vote on assumption. What he is asking these congressmen to do is vote against the best interests of their own constituency. Because since their states had paid off most of the Revolutionary War debt, their citizens were being asked to subsidize, under the Assumption Bill, to subsidize the payment of New England's debts and Pennsylvania's debts that would be assumed under the Assumption Bill, which would clearly be in contradiction, in violation of the best interests of their constituents. However, enough of the delegates in attendance are able to convince themselves that their constituents will be better off with the national capital than they would be if assumption was defeated, are able to convince themselves that actually they are representing the best interests of their constituents by reversing their votes and supporting assumption of state debts. And the Assumption Bill passes. It is very interesting to read Jefferson's account of this particular deal, because Jefferson is adamant that he didn't do anything wrong, that he didn't play politics, that he didn't sell out anybody. Jefferson's argument is that he merely provided the opportunity, the place for the deal to happen, but that he didn't participate in it at all. He didn't make a recommendation. He didn't take a side. He just merely brought the parties together. Later in life, he writes a letter to that effect in order to try to dissuade those who continue to believe that this was a quid pro quo deal and that Jefferson was a major player in pulling it off. Jefferson goes to great lengths after his retirement from the White House to deny the reality of his involvement. But it's a fantastic story. It's a story that one of the reasons it's so complicated is because it's a story that goes on for so long. It is an issue through much of the Revolution, through most of the Confederation period, and the issue isn't decided until now with the passage of the Assumption Bill in early 1790. So it's an issue that spans more than a decade. And so there's so much information, so much data, that, unless you are devoting your life to working through the specifics of that deal, it becomes very, very difficult to even understand. Richjord has about 20 pages of text in one of his chapters in Chesapeake Politics that deals with the location of the national capital. And of course, his major focus is on Maryland and Virginia and their role in this. But mainly what he's talking about is who's making alliances with the Potomac interests. That, for example, New York, the interests of New York, once they begin to see that Philadelphia might have a better chance for the national capital than they do, New York delegates begin to start looking around for allies. And they begin to support Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, with the idea that once the Philadelphia interests become aware that New York and the Potomac interests are forming an alliance, that the Philadelphia interests might back off for fear that they would in the end lose to New York. And it's that kind of manipulation and stuff. It's very, very complicated. But the solution to the issue, of course, is assumption for the national capital. That's the first two parts of Hamilton's five-part financial program. The third key portion of Hamilton's program, I'm keeping my eye on the clock here. We've got about 2 minutes before we get to the top of the hour. The third part of the program is the creation of the United States Bank. Most textbooks cover this in some detail. Hamilton believes, obviously, that the financial future of the nation demands fiscal management, financial management. You got to have banks. You got to have banks that can make loans to new businesses. If you're going to encourage business growth, if you're going to encourage entrepreneurism, then you have to make low interest money available to businesses. And so to him, the creation of a United States bank is critical to the future of the nation and to the success of his program. From the perspective of Madison, Jefferson, and those people in the South, the creation of a United States bank is only going to benefit certain people. It's going to benefit the financial communities in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Providence and all the rest of it. But it's not going to do anything for the Potomac. It's not going to do anything for the West. And so Madison and Jefferson begin to do all they can do to defeat the bank. And their major argument, as we know, because this is what the textbook tell us, their major argument is that nowhere in the Constitution of the United States is Congress given the power to create a bank. And that therefore Hamilton's proposal to fund the creation of a United States bank is a violation of the Constitution. It's an overstepping, an abuse of power by the federal government. Hamilton counters this position by pointing to the very famous necessary and proper clause in Article Article 1, Section 10. Article 2, Section 10, of the Constitution, where Congress's powers are listed, and at the very end, Congress is granted the power to do what is necessary to carry out all the preceding powers. And Hamilton obviously points out that Congress is given the authority to print money. States are denied that. Congress is given the ability to regulate commerce. Congress has put the government in the business of dealing in high finance. And therefore it only stands to reason that there needs to be a bank in order for that high finance to be successful. Both of them make their case to President Washington, and as we know, President Washington comes down on the side of Hamilton's argument and focusing on the so-called necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. Congress approves the creation of the United States Bank. It is only approved for 20 years. I believe it's 20 years. At which point the charter comes up for renewal. It's during that fight over renewal in 1819 that the Supreme Court case under John Marshall of McCulloch versus Maryland comes up. When the time for the bank to come up for renewal, charter renewal, that's when the issue of the legitimacy goes to court, and that's when John Marshall comes down on the side of the right of government under the necessary and proper clause to create a bank. And some of you will remember that some time ago here at the Virtual Center, we went through the decision in McCulloch versus Maryland. And one of the things we learned is that while most people focus on the bank as being the key question in that case, the real issue in that case is government's role in chartering corporations. And in that case, Marshall makes at least a suggestion about corporate personhood. The idea that corporations need to have the same rights under the Constitution as persons in certain cases. Even though Marshall acknowledges that corporations are man-made institutions and that they are not human beings and that they differ from human beings, he points out that under certain circumstances, corporations do need to be granted certain rights under the Constitution. And that's the first indication that we have of what's later going to become the issue of today, which is the personhood of corporations. And we know that that was a major factor in the Citizens United decision in 2010. That as corporations are treated as corporate persons, they are entitled to the same rights of free speech as human beings. And for government to limit the amount of campaign money that can go into campaigns from corporations is a violation of their rights to free speech. All of this goes all the way back to Hamilton's argument in 1790 for the legitimacy of the Bank of the United States. And that's the third piece of Hamilton's 5-part puzzle. It is 4 minutes after the hour, and I think it's time that we pause and take our 5-minute break. We'll come back and then we'll complete Hamilton's program. There are only 2 parts left, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the overall significance of the program and the package. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. We're going to be back after a 5-minute break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour of the Virtual Center today on this beautiful Monday. It is the second day of November in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you. If you are just joining us, welcome. We're into the midst or into the heart of Alexander Hamilton's financial program, as it were. If you're just joining us, you can pick us right up. We've been through funding and assumption, and we just completed the passage of the United States Bank prior to our break at the top of the hour, and we have 2 portions of the program to go. It is a pleasure to be with you if you are just joining us, and if you were kind enough to be with us in the very beginning of our program and remain with us, then I want to thank you specifically for that. Thank you for your support of the program and your support of the Head On Radio Network. Our phone number, if you would like to reach us and make comment on today's program, our phone number is area code 304-640-6495. 304-640-6495. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, my email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And again, I remind you of our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will see a number of the postings that have gone on that center, on that page of late in the last 4 or 5 days from the Virtual Center. Again, thank you. It is a pleasure to be with you, and it's obviously, I think, somewhat obvious that I really can get into this program. I believe it's incredibly important. Every time I do it, I begin to recognize how important this program is. Just a few general comments about what we've looked at so far. When one looks at the speculation opportunities presented to investors, to financial speculators in this nation, the opportunities presented in both the funding and the assumption bills, one can begin to realize the playing out of the political motives associated with Hamilton's plan. That literally what he is doing is buying the support of the powerful and the influential in this country who will derive direct financial benefit from a strong, vibrant government. By definition, government will be able to meet its obligations. Government will be able to pay the interest on its debt each and every year. And of course, from Hamilton's perspective, whether the $90 million total is ever really paid or not is not really the issue. And then when you look at the third part of the program, which is the creation of the United States Bank, it's very obvious that that bank is going to represent certain interests in certain portions of the country to the exclusion of others. There doesn't seem to be any place in the bank legislation that will benefit the South or benefit the West or benefit small farmers in the West, but rather most of the benefits of the establishment and functioning of a bank, of a national bank, will go directly to certain financial interests. And of course, the irony is many of these interests are the same interests that will benefit from the speculative opportunities associated with funding and assumption. So you can begin to see where the seeds of concern and opposition to this program would come from. It becomes very clear early on that Hamilton's program seems to be quite sectional in nature. It seems to be aimed at benefiting certain interests in certain portions of the nation, namely the financial and commercial and investment interests located along the coast and in most of the major cities, which are located either in the middle colonies or in the New England colonies. So again, it looks like government is playing favorites, that it's discriminating against the interests of one section of the country in favor of another. The fourth proposal or portion of Hamilton's overall program is the introduction of what we call today a protective tariff in order to stimulate American manufacturing, infant manufacturing in the New World. New businesses need the help that government is able to provide it. So by instituting a protective tariff, a tax on imports, government is able to stimulate manufacturing in America by encouraging consumers to buy American. And I know that most people understand this, but there may be some that don't. It's kind of it's a basic principle of finance. If you want, and I'm using these just as examples, if you want the American consumer to buy Fords and Chevys, then you want to try to discourage them from buying Toyotas and Hondas. And a way that you can do that, one way, is to increase the tax on Toyotas and Hondas coming into the United States for sale. And we know that it's kind of an ongoing principle of business, that when government establishes a tax on a product, it's added to the total price of the product. In other words, the higher the government tariff on foreign imports is, the more expensive the foreign products become to the consumer. That's what a tariff is, a tax on imports. But a protective tariff has not only economic benefits, but political ones as well. If the tariff on imports is high enough, then it drives the price of foreign-made products up so high that it encourages consumers to not buy them, but to look seriously at Fords and Chevys, as an example. And so the idea behind this, obviously, is that government is doing everything it can to promote and encourage new manufacturing in the new nation. I usually make a point of this particular issue, although I don't notice it that often in textbooks and things. I'm kind of surprised. I would think that more people would make an issue, would make mention of this, because it's obvious, but it seems to be important. If you think back to the controversy between the colonies and the mother country prior to the Declaration of Independence, you remember that Parliament passed a series of so-called navigation acts during the colonial period. There were a whole series of them. As students, many of us had to memorize the different navigation acts that were passed by Parliament. And the whole idea behind the navigation acts was to channel the wealth of the colony back to the mother country by making it illegal for colonies to ship goods directly to Europe. The idea is that American products, raw materials, would be shipped to England, and then English merchants would transport it to Europe. They would become the brokers or the middlemen, if you will, in this international trade. That way the business would benefit the mother country and not England's rivals, European rivals. other navigation acts made it illegal for colonies to process raw materials within the colonies. Many of you, for example, will remember in 1750, Parliament passing an act called the Hat Act. Oh, actually, I'm wrong on my dates. That was 1733, as I recall. In 1750, Parliament passed what is called the Iron Act. What these pieces of legislation did was forbid the colonists from processing raw materials into finished products. Because the processing of raw materials into finished products is what constitutes job growth. If you want to generate jobs, employment, then what you do is you forbid the processing of raw materials in the colonies, and you guarantee all of that business will occur within the mother country itself. So as colonies, the American colonies were required to ship their raw materials, their raw wealth, natural resources, their iron ore, their timber, their corn, their tobacco, their wheat, whatever it was, to the mother country. And whatever benefits the sale of those would have on the continent of Europe, these would be benefits that would go to the mother country, not to the colonists. So in a sense, the Navigation Acts were a legitimate part of British colonial policy. The whole purpose of colonies was to generate wealth for the mother country. So the Navigation Acts from the mother country's point of view were perfectly understandable, perfectly logical, and were to be expected. But if you look at the Navigation Acts from the perspective of the colonists rather than the perspective of the mother country, then what these acts do is inhibit growth within the colonies. It inhibits circulating money, a circulating medium of exchange, as it's called, in the colonies. It inhibits business. It not only inhibits, it makes manufacturing illegal. And it guarantees that manufacturing jobs will be reserved for the mother country. My point is that when you look at Hamilton's program, the protective tariff is perfectly understandable because it's manufacturing that the colonial status as colonies prevented. In other words, it's the manufacturing capabilities within America that need stimulation because they were the very economic programs or potential that was being stifled by the mother country. So it stands to reason that Hamilton's program would seek to stimulate those areas of the economy that Great Britain went out of its way to inhibit. But again, where within colonial America, or within the newly American nation of America under the Constitution, where would infant manufacturing be located? And we know about the growth of the textile mills on the rivers, along the rivers in New England, and the emergence and growth of towns like Haverhill and Lowell and Lawrence, and all of those towns along the Mystic River in northern Massachusetts, just south of the New Hampshire border, that run into the Atlantic. And the fact that the water power from these rivers made the location of textile mills along those rivers the sensible thing to do. So in effect, what Hamilton's program was doing was stimulating the economy in exactly those areas that needed stimulation. But from the position or the perspective of the South, it added further fuel to the flames of allegations of favoritism, of sectional favoritism. Actually, Hamilton's protective tariff program wasn't nearly as successful as it was to become later. Tariff legislation was passed, but it wasn't nearly as high. It wasn't high enough to accomplish all that Hamilton hoped it would accomplish. The last part of Hamilton's program was the establishment of an excise tax on consumer products. A tax, a use tax, that American citizens would pay in order to generate revenue so that the new government would have some chance to be successful. During Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, two members of his so-called brain trust, Rexford Tugwell and Joseph Dorfman, wrote an article in 1938 that appeared in the Columbia University Quarterly. And the title of that article was Alexander Hamilton, Nation Maker. And it was a glowing account of the insight and the vision that Hamilton's program revealed for the growth of the new nation. Tugwell and Dorfman are literally saying that more than anything else, Hamilton's financial program put the new nation on a solid financial footing. And of course, what they were doing in the 1930s as part of Roosevelt's New Deal program was suggesting that government, in order to meet the threat of the Depression, government needed to rediscover or to revisit Hamilton's program and begin to enact the same kinds of legislation that would do the same kinds of things for the country to help pull it out of the Depression. And of course, out of this, as we know, came Social Security and minimum wage and many of the other things that we continue to struggle over today. In this article, written by Tugwell and Dorfman, entitled Alexander Hamilton, Nation Maker, the authors state the following. The reports of Hamilton in 1790 and 91, taken together, constitute a theoretical plan which is just beginning to be appreciated. The economic organization logically involved was grand and imperial in scope. A fully negotiable funded debt, drained originally from the small property classes and met by taxes paid by the masses, was to be used by an emerging moneyed class to create profitable speculative enterprises in lands, industry, and finance. The last part of this quote makes specific reference to the excise tax. Hamilton believed, and in fact, as a member of the New York legislature prior to the Constitution, said this, that there's no better way to build patriotism and a sense of belonging to something important than by making everybody pay for the privilege of being here. Hamilton was talking about the social and political advantages of taxes. That when people pay taxes, they establish or they create a sense of ownership in what happens. They establish or derive a reason to support government, a reason to become more aware of what government is doing. They become better citizens. This is part of their civic responsibility. In this case, what Hamilton is doing is proposing that the masses pay the excise tax in order to generate the revenue necessary to pay for the rest of the program. The money comes from the people. The beneficiaries are the people. The beneficiaries of the money are the powerful, influential, wealthy few. Government literally is taking money from the people and moving it into the coffers of the wealthy, of the investors. I think many of us see this happening today with our income taxes. Corporations are able, seems to find loopholes in our tax laws, which make it entirely possible that many of the largest corporations pay nothing, while the average citizens who can't afford the legal support or the legal help necessary to find those loopholes or to take advantage of those loopholes end up paying the bills. I think basically what we're talking about here is one of the major reasons why Bernie Sanders' campaign is getting the degree of support it does. Hamilton builds the excise tax into his program as a key part of it. It's what makes it's what makes community community. It's what makes all of us players in the game. It gives all of us a sense of relevance and importance in the overall success of the venture. It's not a situation where a few pay and the rest gain benefits from it. It's a situation where everybody pays for the benefit of all of us. Obviously, there are individuals who don't agree. Jefferson and Hamilton are among them. And there's no question that in the emerging political opposition to Hamilton's overall program that begins in Congress, but eventually wends its way throughout the nation as a whole, we begin to see the emergence of a party system, if you will, a two-party system within the newly created nation. And many people, going back to Madison's Federalist Number 10 concern for the violence of factions, many people equate the existence of parties with factions. These are self-interested, well-organized groups who are organized for their own financial benefit. So there's concern about them. There's absolutely no question then that the emergence of what becomes the two-party system in America is born in opposition to Hamilton's program. It's there as the product of a well-organized campaign to organize this opposition into a viable political opposition party. In spite of the fact that Jefferson becomes the so-called titular head of this party, Jefferson's name is on it. The party is called Jeffersonian Republican. Jefferson is not directly involved in the organization and the creation of this opposition. He kind of moves in later in the 1790s. There's no question that a major architect of the two-party system in America is none other than James Madison. Madison uses his position in the House of Representatives to orchestrate and organize the opposition to Hamilton's program. And historians have struggled ever since with the apparent change of heart in the person of James Madison. Here's the person who argued so vehemently against factions in Federalist Number 10 and advocated the need for the Constitution of the United States in order to vitiate the existence of a majority faction. Here's the same guy leading the creation of an alternative party to the Washington administration, to the Federalists in power. And historians have wrestled with this apparent shift in midstream. And depending on who you read, the arguments vary. From those who believe that Madison always was a Southerner, always was a Virginia gentleman, and when he entered the House of Representatives, entered Congress as a representative from the state of Virginia, he resumed his priorities as a Virginia gentleman, and he began to espouse and speak for the sectional interests of the South against the urban industrial growing interests of the North, reflected in the person of Alexander Hamilton and in the agenda and priorities of the Federalist Party. There are other people who argue that the fault lies with Hamilton, and that Hamilton's program was so clearly sectional, was so clearly political, was so patently unfair in its conscious efforts to reward the few at the expense of the many, that there really was nothing to do but find a way to legitimize that and find a way to insert it and make it a viable part of America's political reality. Because the fact of the matter is, if you read Washington and you read Hamilton, their positions suggest that in a popular government, in a republic, there's no place for opposition parties. There's no justification for them, because government is the people's party. And in belonging to an opposition, you are belonging to a coalition against the best interests or the will of the people themselves. To Washington and Hamilton, there's one party, the government party, the official party, the government of George Washington. And as loyal Americans, citizens have a responsibility to support, abide by, and follow the law. And if they choose not to do that, then they are enemies of the people's government. And government ought to have, and indeed does have, under the Constitution, the authority to enforce the law and to come down hard on those who refuse to comply. So in Pennsylvania in 1793, Hamilton becomes directly involved in the so-called Whiskey Rebellion, which obviously is tied directly to the excise tax on alcohol. And what we find is that many producers of grain, of wheat and rye, find it cheaper to convert their crops to alcohol and to transport the alcohol to market for sale or to use it themselves. But the fact of the matter is, distillers in western Pennsylvania object to and refuse to abide by Hamilton's excise tax. And they begin to arrest and intimidate federal tax collectors out there to collect the tax. And the Whiskey Rebellion in American history becomes the first example of open obstinacy, open opposition to the laws under the new federal Constitution. And this becomes the place where the personality of Alexander Hamilton seems to become clear to many. Hamilton sees opposition to the excise tax not as a threat to the nation, but as an opportunity for the government to demonstrate to its own citizens its determination to enforce the law. This is open rebellion against the government of the United States, Hamilton argues. And the Constitution of the United States was ratified by the people of the United States in order to give government the authority to suppress exactly this kind of insurrection. Hamilton persuades President Washington to come down hard on the whiskey rebels. He also is successful in persuading Washington to appoint him as the head of the federal army that marches into western Pennsylvania to crush the rebellion. The stories in the media, of course, suggest that there really is no rebellion. I mean, I think those who understand what I'm talking about, I mean, there's a rebellion and then there's no rebellion. When the army marches into western Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion, there isn't any. There are a number of stills that nobody can find. And so the opposition press, and by this time there is a viable opposition press orchestrated in part by Madison, but also a participant in this is John Beckley, who's Speaker of the House of Representatives from Virginia, after whom Beckley, West Virginia, is named. The city that I broadcast from, I live in. And Beckley's role politically in the early Congresses as organizer, as political organizer and manipulator extraordinaire of the organization of the Republican opposition to Hamilton and to Hamilton's program is incredible. He works very closely, hand in hand, with James Madison. And the press runs story after story mocking Hamilton, mocking the rebellion that wasn't there. But again, to Hamilton, it's the message government is sending, not the size of the reality of the threat against it, that is really the issue here. And so what there is of a risky rebellion is crushed in 1793. I would like to use, we've got about 15 minutes, a little bit less than 15 minutes left in our program today. I'd like to use it to spend a little bit of time reflecting on Hamilton's program, as a package. That's the way he presented it. That's the way he got it through. He kept arguing that if you take a portion of his program away, you basically destroy or sink the entire program. He saw it as a package. I'd like to spend a few moments reflecting on this, because what it suggests is the playing out of a tradition in this new country under the Constitution that is not new. What we are talking about here is the emergence of capitalism. But manufacturing at this point is not a factor. It's too early for that. At this point, the capitalism in question is commercial capitalism. It's commerce. It's international trade. And it's important to mention that when Adam Smith writes his Wealth of Nations in 1776 and begins to talk about the benefits or the advantages of the market, the so-called magic of the market, that's the term used by President Reagan, Ronald Reagan. Much of the market or the commercialism that Adam Smith is talking about is just that, commercial capitalism. What we are seeing here is the role of government in the creation of successful capitalism. We are seeing capitalism in its early stages. And we are seeing the dramatic role, the dramatic part that government must play in capitalism in order for it to be successful. We are seeing a very close reciprocal relationship between government and the economy, between government and business, between government and the so-called middle class. If capitalism is to be successful, then it will happen as a result of government support. If you leave business to fend for itself at this early stage, it's bound to fail. Business needs the support of government in order to get off the ground and be successful. And this reciprocal relationship between business and government is really what drives the emergence of capitalism at the beginning. It is associated with the emergence of the modern nation state in the West. The emergence of nations as Europe evolves from the so-called Middle Ages into the modern period, the emergence of nations under strong governance is a key phenomenon in modernization. And the emergence of business, the emergence of a middle class, more importantly, I think, the emergence of a perspective which we associate with capitalism. The idea of investment, the idea of profit as being legitimate, the idea of gradually ending the idea that usury, making money from loaning money. The Catholic Church during the medieval period called usury, and it was a sin. With the emergence of capitalism, we begin to see the attacks against usury decline. And charging money to make money is considered to be legitimate and to be part of business itself. All of this becomes instrumental in the emergence of modern capitalism. But at this point, we're not talking about anything like what we call later on laissez-faire. Government staying out of business and allowing business to have its freedom, to have its head, so to speak. Because at this early point, giving business its head without government support will kill it. The only way that capitalism can emerge successfully at all is with the support of government. But on the other hand, it's important to understand why government needs the support of business. Obviously, the purpose of government is to govern in the best interests of its own people. And if the best interests of its people becomes tied to what we call economic development, to job growth, to economic opportunity, then obviously government's popularity with its own people is dependent on its ability, government's ability to generate economic growth, which means bring in wealth, create jobs. In turn, that means bring in raw materials. And in turn, that means founding colonies. By planting overseas colonies, nations under strong governments are able successfully to claim control over regions of the world theoretically rich in natural resources. Natural resources which can be extracted and transported to the mother country, there to be finished into products for sale in the open market. The job growth and the opportunities available through this kind of economic development is the basis upon which citizens evaluate the success and the popularity of their own governments. It's business, it's the investor, it's companies that are able to raise capital in order to engage in economic activity that generate the wealth. So therefore, government needs business as much as business needs government. It's a reciprocal relationship. Both sides derive benefit from it. If you think back to your early history, early American history, when the king, James I, issues the first charter to the Virginia Company for a group of explorers to go to Virginia, which was, of course, different than it is now, and seek wealth. The funds are put up by the so-called Virginia Company. It's an investment company. It's a business venture. It's driven by the search for wealth. Its objective is profit. And by giving the Virginia Company a charter to Virginia, what government is doing is guaranteeing this company a monopoly. The investors in the Virginia Company are saying to James I, we're risking our wealth, our treasure, in pursuit of this wealth. We need your support. Whatever you can do to help us, we need. The king's response is a charter, which is a guaranteed right to exploit. By definition, colonies are created to be exploited. They are not created to have their own rights or to generate their own wealth or to enter into competition with businesses located in the mother country. In theory, the empire, by definition, is a family. It's a community where everybody has a role to play in the overall success and power of the empire. Colony's role in that game plan or in that scheme is to generate the raw materials, the natural wealth, whatever it might be that exists in the colony. The point I'm making is the first charter for the Virginia Company is issued by James I in 1603. That Hamilton would devise a program in 1789 to enlist government in the promotion of manufacturing and the promotion of business and wealth in America is nothing new. It's been going on for 200 years. It's an example of government doing everything it can to support economic growth. Consequently, it's from that perspective, it seems to me, that one can and must look at Hamilton's overall program. But this is my parting comment because we've got less than a minute to go. Nowhere in the world does anybody say that this is fair. Hamilton said at the very beginning of funding, fairness has no business in this game. Thank you for tuning in to today's edition of the Virtual Center. We're just turning the top of the hour. I want to thank you. I want to invite you back tomorrow. A reminder that we'll be beginning 1/2 hour late tomorrow. This is Bill O'Brien. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe, be kind to each other, and thank you.